Mr. Speaker, I wish to make a statement on a significant data protection breach from February 2022 relating to the Afghan Relocations and Assistance Policy. This led to the High Court granting an unprecedented super injunction and the previous government establishing a secret Afghan resettlement route. Today, I'm announcing to the House a change in government policy. I'm closing this resettlement route, I'm disclosing the data loss, and I'm confirming that the court order was lifted at 12 noon today. Members of this House, including you, Mr. Speaker, and myself, have been subject to this super injunction. It is unprecedented. And to be clear, the court has always recognised the parliamentary privilege of proceedings in this House, and ministers decided not to tell parliamentarians at an earlier stage about the data incident, as the widespread publicity would increase the risk of the Taliban obtaining the data set. But as parliamentarians and as government ministers, it has been deeply uncomfortable to be constrained from reporting to this House. And I'm grateful today to be able to disclose the details to Parliament. And I trust you, Mr. Speaker, and members will bear with me if I take the time to ensure the House now has the fullest information possible, something I discussed with you, Mr. Speaker, yesterday. Mr. Speaker, the facts are as follows. In February 2022, 10 months after the then Defence Secretary Ben Wallace introduced the Afghan Relocations and Assistance Policy, 6 months after the fall of Kabul, a defence official emailed an Arap caseworking file outside of authorised government systems. Arap, as the House knows, is the resettlement scheme that this country established for Afghan citizens who worked for or with our UK armed forces over the combat years of Afghanistan. And both in opposition and in government, we have backed this scheme. I know Arap also has had the full support from across this House. Now, this official mistakenly believed that they were sending the names of 150 applicants. However, the spreadsheet in fact contained personal information associated to 18,714 Afghans who had applied either to the ex gratia or the Arap scheme on or before the 7th of January 2022. It contained names and contact details of applicants and, in some instances, information relating to applicants' family members. And in a small number of cases, Mr. Speaker, the names of members of Parliament, senior military officers and government officials were noted as supporting the application. This was a serious departmental error. It was in clear breach of strict data protection protocols, and it was one of many data losses relating to the Arap scheme during this period. Now, previous government ministers first became aware of this data loss in mid-August 2023, 18 months after the incident. They became aware of the loss when personal details of 9 individuals from the dataset appeared online. Action was taken to ensure they were swiftly removed, an internal investigation was conducted, and the incident was reported both to the Metropolitan Police and to the Information Commissioner. The Met deemed that no criminal investigation was necessary, and the Information Commissioner has continued to work with the department throughout. However, journalists were almost immediately aware of the breach, and the previous administration applied to the High Court for an injunction to prevent the data loss becoming public. The judge deemed the risk warranted going further, and on the 1st of September 2023, granted a super injunction, which prevented the disclosure of the very existence of the injunction. Mr. Speaker, that super injunction has been in place for nearly 2 years, during which time 8 media organisations and their journalists have been served to prohibit any reporting. And no government wishes to withhold information from the British public, from parliamentarians, or the press in this manner. In autumn 2023, previous ministers started work on establishing a new settlement scheme, specifically designed for people in this compromised data set who were not eligible for Arap. Not eligible for Arap, but nevertheless judged to be at the highest risk of reprisals by the Taliban. It is known as the Afghan Response Route, ARR. It was covered by the super injunction. And the then government initially established the ARR to resettle a target cohort of around 200 principals. But in early 2024, a combination of the Minister's decisions on the scheme's policy design and the court's views had broadened this category to nearly 3,000 principals. I want to provide assurance, Mr. Speaker, both to the House and to the British public, that all individuals relocated under the Afghan Response Route, Arap, or the Home Office's ACRS scheme undergo strict national security checks before being able to enter our country. And the full number of Afghan arrivals under all schemes have been reported in the regular Home Office statistics, meaning that they are already counted in the existing migration figures. Now, as Shadow Defence Secretary, I was initially briefed on the ARR by James Heapy, the former Armed Forces Minister, on the 12th of December 2023, and issued with the super injunction at the start of that meeting. Other members of the present Cabinet were only informed of the evidence of the data breach, the operation of the ARR, and the existence of the super injunction on taking office after the general election. By this time, the ARR scheme was fully established and in operation. By this time, it was nearly 2.5 years since the data loss. I have felt deeply concerned about the lack of transparency to Parliament and to the public. I felt it only right to assess the decision-making criteria for the ARR. So we began, straight away, to take a hard look at the policy complexities, the costs, the risks, the court hearings, and the range of Afghan relocation schemes that the previous government was running. Cabinet colleagues endorsed the need for new insights into the scheme in autumn last year while the scheme kept running, and in December 2024 I announced the streamlining of the range of government schemes that we inherited into the Afghan resettlement programme to better establish value for money, establish a single set of time-limited entitlements, and support to get the Afghan families resettled. And I would like to thank, on behalf of the House, Mr. Speaker, our colleagues in local government without whom this unified resettlement programme would simply not be possible. And then at the beginning of this year, I commissioned Paul Rimmer, a senior former civil servant, an ex-deputy director of the Chief of Defence Intelligence, to conduct an independent review. This review was concluded and reported to ministers last month. Today, I'm releasing a public version of Rimmer's review, and I'm placing a copy of that in the Library of the House. I'm very grateful to him for his work. Mr. Speaker, despite brutal human rights abuses in Afghanistan, the Rimmer review notes the passage of time, nearly 4 years since the fall of Kabul, and concludes, first, and I quote, "There is little evidence of intent by the Taliban to conduct a campaign of retribution against former officials. Second, those who pose a challenge to the Taliban rule now are at greater risk of a reaction from the regime. 3, the wealth of data inherited from the former government by the Taliban would already enable them to target individuals if they wish to do so. Which means, fourthly, he concludes, and I quote, "It is highly unlikely that merely being on the spreadsheet would be the piece of information enabling or prompting the Taliban to act." However, Rimmer is clear. He stresses the uncertainty in any judgments, and he does not rule out any risk. Yet he concludes, given this updated context, that the current policy we inherited appears, and I quote, "an extremely significant intervention to address the potentially limited net additional risk the incident likely presents." Mr. Speaker, the Rimmer review is a very significant but not the sole element in the government's decision to change policy. To change policy, to close the ARR, and to ensure that court order is lifted today. Policy concerns about proportionality, about public accountability, about cost, about fairness were also important factors to the government. And this was not a decision taken lightly. It follows a lengthy process, including the Rimmer review, detailed ministerial discussions, and repeated consultations with legal advisors. And just as I have changed government policy in light of the Rimmer review, so the High Court today, in light of the Rimmer review, ruled that there is no tenable basis for the continuation of the super injunction. Mr. Speaker, to date, 900 ARR principals are in Britain or in transit, together with 3,600 family members, at a cost of around £400 million. From today, there will be no new ARR offers of relocation to Britain. From today, the route is now closed. However, we will honour the 600 invitations already made to any named persons still in Afghanistan and their immediate family. When this nation makes a promise, we should keep it. Today, Mr. Speaker, I'm also restoring full accountability for the government's Afghan relocation scheme to Parliament. And I would expect our select committees to hold us account now through the in-depth inquiries. Let me turn, if I may, now to the practical action that we've taken as a result of this policy change and in preparation for the lifting of the court super injunction. Mr. Speaker, my first concern has been to notify as many as possible affected by the data incident and provide them with further advice. The MoD has done this morning, although I have to say to the House it has not been possible to contact every individual on the dataset due to its incomplete and out-of-date information. However, anyone who may be concerned can head to our new dedicated gov.uk website, wherein they will find more information about the data loss, further security advice, a self-checker tool which will inform them whether their application has been affected, and contact steps for the Detailed Information Services Centre, which the MoD has established. Mr. Speaker, this serious data incident should never have happened. It may have occurred 3 years ago under the previous government, but to all those whose information was compromised, I offer a sincere apology today on behalf of the British government. And I trust the Shadow Defence Secretary, as a former Defence Minister, will join me in this. Mr. Speaker, to date, 36,000 Afghans have been accepted by Britain through the range of relocation schemes. Britain has honoured the duty we owe to those who worked and fought alongside our troops in Afghanistan. The British people have welcomed them to our country, and in turn, this is their chance to rebuild their lives, their chance to contribute and to share in the prosperity of our great country. However, none of these relocation schemes can carry on in perpetuity, nor were they conceived to do so. That's why on the 1st of July, we announced that we would no longer accept new applicants to Arap. However, I will reiterate the commitment we made then to process every outstanding Arap application and relocate those who may prove eligible. And we will complete our commitment to continuing the review of the triples. Mr. Speaker, I recognise my statement will prompt many questions. I would have wanted to settle these matters sooner, because full accountability to Parliament and freedom of the press matter deeply to me. They're fundamental to our British way of life. However, lives may have been at stake. And I've spent many hours thinking about this decision, thinking about the safety and the lives of people I will never meet in a far-off land in which 457 of our servicemen and women lost their lives. So this weighs heavily on me, and it's why no government could take such decisions lightly without sound grounds and hard deliberations. During this last year, we have conducted and we have now completed this work. I commend this statement to the House.
Show Secretary of State James Cartledge.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm grateful to the Secretary of State both for advance side of his statement and for receipt early this morning of a hard copy of the RIMA review. And can I thank the Secretary of State and the Minister of the Armed Forces for briefing me yesterday and for briefing other parliamentary colleagues today. Furthermore, given the nature of the super injunction, Mr. Speaker, and the fact that the timing and nature of this statement relates entirely to the court's lifting of that super injunction, I also recognise that it was entirely right for the Secretary of State to update the House at the earliest opportunity and welcome the opportunity colleagues now have to scrutinise these matters. To declare an interest, Mr. Speaker, I was a Minister at the MoD in August 2023 when the Department first became aware of the breach. My main role being to chair one meeting on the matter in August 2023 because I was the duty minister, but thereafter being Minister for Defence Procurement and this sitting outside my portfolio, I had relatively minimal direct involvement. That said, the Secretary of State has issued an apology on behalf of the government, and I join him in that, and in recognising that this data leak should never have happened and was an unacceptable breach of all relevant data protocols. And I agree it is right that an apology is issued specifically to those whose data was compromised. It is nevertheless a fact that cannot be ignored that when this breach came to light, the immediate priority of the then government was to avoid a very specific and terrible scenario, namely, an error by an official of the British state leading to torture or even murder of persons in the dataset at the hands of what remains a brutal Taliban regime. As the RIMA review confirms, that scenario, thankfully, appears to have been avoided. Of course, the RIMA review was set up in January and reported to the Secretary of State in June, as we understand. I want to be clear, Mr. Speaker, it is entirely appropriate that the Secretary of State has sought to update the Department's understanding of the threat on the ground in Afghanistan that exists today, particularly for those persons in the data set who had previously been concluded to be at greatest risk of reprisals. However, the House will appreciate that when ministers became aware of this data breach in August 2023, we did not have the luxury of 6 months to assess the situation. As RIMA says at paragraph 53, and I quote, the review notes that the passage of time is particularly relevant. And I know that my former ministerial colleague, former Minister of the Armed Forces, James Heapy, who led the response to the leak, will have been focused entirely on what he saw as his duty of care to those at risk of reprisals, based on the threat assessment that pertained at the time. But any threat picture is constantly evolving. And as I say, I support the Secretary of State's decision to review the MoD's understanding of the threat, and given the latest situation as reported by RIMA, we support his conclusion that the Afghanistan Response Route, the ARR, can now be closed. Turning to the super injunction, I do entirely understand why this will be the subject of considerable interest, particularly for the newspapers and media outlets concerned. We have an independent judiciary, and it is not for me to comment on either the decision to grant the injunction in the first place, nor to lift it today. But it is surely telling that the RIMA Review paragraph 56 states that planning at the time the government became aware of this breach in the summer of 2023 was based, and I quote directly, on a risk judgment that were the Taliban to secure access to the data set, the consequences for affected individuals may be serious. Had that not been the case, no doubt the court would have been less likely to grant the injunction, and certainly not a super injunction. So on the leak, can the Secretary of State confirm that this was by a civil servant and that ministers at the time took steps to change the casework procedure, i.e. not using spreadsheets sent by email, but moving to a more secure system fully within the entirely secure network? And can he confirm that although the data set was circa 18,000, only a relatively small portion of that data set was identified as being at high risk of reprisals, and only a small number have been settled here, which is why, as he stated today, the cost is around £400 million, not the figure of £7 billion that is being reported elsewhere? And can I agree with him that now that these matters are rightly in the public domain, that given the reassessment of the threat in the RIMA review, it would be wholly appropriate for the Select Committee and others to look into these matters further? Can the Secretary of State comment on one very specific item being reported? That, and I'm not referring to the person who made the leak, but another apparent third party who obtained some of the data was engaged in blackmail. Did the original Metropolitan Police investigation look at this? And if not, will he consider reopening it so that the police can have another look at that very specific point, which is very serious in its implications? Finally, we must recognise the huge role played by Afghan nationals in support of our armed forces. But any policy in this area must always be balanced against our own national interest. We support the government in closing the ARR scheme, and as we did with their decision to close the full Arap programme.
Secretary of State.
Mr. Speaker, can I welcome the tone in which the Shadow Defence Secretary has responded? Can I welcome him joining me in the apology on behalf of the British Government to those whose data has been compromised? And can I welcome also his acceptance that he put it's entirely appropriate for the Defence Secretary now, as part of a new government, to look to up to date the Department's assessment of the threat. And I am very pleased, and the House will have noted, that he supports RIMA's conclusions and my policy judgments that the government has announced today. He is right. RIMA, in simple terms, gives us a revised, up-to-date assessment of the risk, and in particular the risk of those individuals whose data may be on that spreadsheet. And he does confirm, highly unlikely, that their name on the data set increases the risk of them being targeted. Mr. Speaker, he asked me 3 or 4 specific questions. He asked about the official. It was a defence official. I can't account for the improvements in data handling that the previous ministers might have taken. What I can say, when I did his job in that period of opposition, was that this data leak was just one of many from the Afghan schemes at the time. And what I can say is that since the election in this last year, we as a government have appointed a new Chief Information Officer. We have installed new software to securely share data, and we have also completed a comprehensive review of the legacy Afghan data on the casework system. On the question of the £7 billion, Mr. Speaker, which I think he may have picked up from court papers, this was a previous estimate. It is not related simply to the Afghan recovery route. It is an estimate of the total cost of all government Afghan schemes for the entire period in which they may operate. And the significance of the decision that I've announced today means that that cost to the taxpayer as a result of the policy decisions we've taken today, compared to simply continuing the policy and schemes we'd inherited, means that the taxpayer will pay 1.2 billion less over this period. It means that around 9,500 fewer Afghans will come to this country. And above all, it means that we have restored proper accountability in this House and proper freedom of the media.
Chair of the Select Committee, Tamerji Singh.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Secretary of State for advance sight of his statement, welcome it, and indeed his intent to now inject parliamentary transparency and scrutiny. However, this whole data breach situation is a mess and is wholly unacceptable. As I mentioned to the Minister for the Armed Forces during our recent secret briefing, that I am certainly minded to recommend to my Defence Committee colleagues that we thoroughly investigate to ascertain what has actually transpired here, given the serious ramifications on so many levels. However, as things stand, notwithstanding the contents of the RIMA review, how confident is my right honourable friend, the Defence Secretary, that the Afghans affected, many of whom bravely supported our service personnel, will not be at risk of recriminations and reprisals?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I can only recommend that he reads in full the public version of the RIMA report that I've published today. The conclusions and the updated risk assessment that RIMA sets out, taking an up-to-date view, recognising that the situation in Afghanistan is now nearly 4 years on from the point at which the Taliban took control, recognising also that the present regime sees those who may threaten the regime itself now as a greater threat to their operation than any perhaps former government official or serving official. So I'd recommend that he reads that, and I expect, as the Defence Select Committee Chair, he will want to take full advantage of this restored parliamentary accountability. I've always believed that our Select Committee system in this House is perfectly capable and actually better suited to many of the in-depth inquiries that often get punted into public inquiries or punted into calls for public inquiries. And I hope my honourable friend would have noted the fact that the Shadow Defence Secretary also endorsed that view.
Why the Liberal Democrats, spokesperson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I also thank the Minister of the Armed Forces for his briefing on this issue this morning. I'm pleased that this House now has the opportunity to scrutinise this alarming data breach. And it's right that the then government moved to introduce a new scheme to try to minimise the risk to the Afghan soldiers and their families who were caught up in this breach, of the 18,714 individuals in total. It's the very least that we owe them, given the sacrifices they made to support our campaign in Afghanistan. And I welcome the apologies from both sides of the House as a result of this data breach. But it does raise serious questions about how this was allowed to happen under the Conservatives' watch and the heightened level of risk it has created for those Afghans involved. So can the Minister confirm what steps have been taken to address the root cause of this breach and to ensure that it cannot happen again? Reporting this afternoon from the Financial Times suggested that an original relocation scheme considered for all 25,000 Afghan personnel could cost up to £7 billion. So will the Secretary of State confirm what assessment his department has made of that figure and why this was kept hidden from the public? The immediate priority must be to ensure the safety of all those individuals caught up in this breach. So what assurances can the Secretary of State provide that lifting of this super injunction now doesn't heighten any dangers for those individuals concerned? And what steps is he taking to ensure that the individuals whose data was leaked are aware of the incident? What additional support is now being provided to them directly now that the case is in the public domain? And in light of these developments, can the Secretary of State outline when the casework and final relocations under this and the Arap scheme will be completed by?
Secretary of State.
Mr. Speaker, can I welcome her response? Can I say that I actually provided answers to the House for 2 or 3 of her questions directly to the Shadow Defence Secretary on the steps that we've taken to ensure that one can never say never, but one can, and I am more confident than I was 12 months ago about the reduced risk of data losses and data breaches in future. I've also given a response on the 7 billion figure, the estimated full costs of all Afghan schemes that will run to their completion from start to finish because of the savings derived from the policy decisions we've taken today will be between 5.5 and 6 billion pounds. The cost of the ARR scheme to date, the cost and the sums committed to bring the 900 principals and their immediate families that are in Britain or in transit is around 400 million, and I expect a similar sum to be the cost of those still to come. Mr. Speaker, finally on RIMA, I think I said in my statement to the House that RIMA recognises the uncertainties, recognises the brutal nature of the Afghan Taliban regime, recognises that there can never be any risk, there can never be no risk in any judgments and decisions like this. It's one of the reasons that this is a decision that the government and I have taken with hard deliberation and serious intent. And, Mr. Speaker, I hope that the House will back it this afternoon.
Dame Emily Thornbury.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. May I begin by saying I'm grateful to the ministerial team for the early briefing that I got on this matter, which gave me an opportunity to read a report that came out from the FAC under the chairmanship of the Right Honourable Member for Tunbridge and Malling. It was begun in September 21 and the report came out in 22. It's called Missing in Action, UK Leadership and the Withdrawal from Afghanistan. It was excoriating. The manner of the withdrawal of international forces from Afghanistan was a disaster, a betrayal of our allies, and weakens the trust that helps to keep British people safe. It said the government should keep better records securely held on locally employed staff, and we've heard this is one of the many data losses from Arap, to ensure that any evacuation can be carried out more effectively. It should devise a policy based on clear and fair principles about the assistance which will be offered to local partners in the event of a security deterioration and report to us when that has been done. I hope that such a policy has been developed, that more lessons have been learned and that the ministers will report to my committee about where we are now.